The boss is 3 seconds from killing my entire party, and I'm just standing there, smiling. Nobody notices yet. They're too busy screaming. The tank is on the ground with his ribs caved in. The mage is out of mana and crawling backward through her own blood. And the S-rank vanguard who's been humiliating me for 6 months, the guy who told the whole guild I was dead weight in a healer's coat, is about to eat a hit that will turn him into paste. That's when I raise my hand and heal him. The healing doesn't look like healing. There's no soft green light, no gentle glow. My palm turns black, veins climbing up my arm like cracks in glass, and the wound on his chest doesn't close so much as it gets ripped away, siphoned out of his body, and dragged through the air toward me. He gasps like he's been stabbed a second time. And half a second later, the boss's skull detonates. Not exaggeration. Detonates. Chunks of bone and dungeon core matter spray across the arena, and the 20-foot horror that was about to end us collapses into a twitching heap of nothing. The room goes dead silent. Every single person in that dungeon turns to look at me, the trash healer, standing there with black veins retreating up my arm and a dead god-tier boss steaming on the floor behind me. I didn't get here by being talented. I got here by being humiliated in front of an entire guild, over and over, until I stopped caring what any of them thought. My name is Rowan Vale, and 6 months ago I was the worst-ranked healer in Ashvane Company, a laughingstock, a joke people told at the bar. Today, I just one-shot a dungeon boss with a heal spell, and nobody in that room has any idea what I actually am. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the humiliation first. Ashvane Company was a mid-tier guild, respectable, ambitious, hungry to break into the top 10 rankings in the capital, and every guild that wants to climb needs healers. So when I tested into the guild as an E-rank support class, they took me. Nobody expected much. E-rank support classes are the bottom of the barrel. The kind of rank you get assigned when the system looks at your soul and basically shrugs. My actual class name was worse than my rank. Most healers get titles like Sacred Mender or Blessed Vessel, something that sounds nice on a guild roster. Mine read differently. Mine said, Reaper's Mercy, unclassified. Unclassified. As if even the system that built the entire magical hierarchy of this world looked at what I was and went, yeah, we don't have a box for that one. At first it didn't matter, because on paper, my healing output was garbage. I'd cast a spell on a wounded teammate, and instead of their wound closing fast and clean like a normal healer's, it would just sort of sit there, barely moving, painfully slow. Guildmates would groan, roll their eyes, mutter that they'd rather bleed out naturally than wait on me. Drayson Thorne, our S-rank vanguard and the guild's golden boy, made it his personal hobby to remind me of that every single day. You know what's worse than no healer? He said once, loud enough for the whole training hall to hear. A healer who makes you feel the wound longer. At least without you, I'd just pass out. With you, I get to enjoy every second of dying. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because what else do you do? But here's the part none of them knew. The part I didn't even fully understand yet myself. My healing wasn't slow because it was weak. It was slow because it wasn't actually healing in the way anyone assumed. It was doing something else entirely, and it took me almost losing my life to find out what. That happened on a routine job, an E-rank swamp dungeon, the kind of assignment guilds throw at rookies to pad monthly quotas. Low risk, low reward. Nobody important goes. Which meant nobody important was there to see what happened when a low-tier dungeon glitched and spawned a mutated bog serpent 3 tiers above its supposed difficulty. It nearly killed the 2 junior scouts I was paired with. One of them, a girl named Ivy who was maybe 17, took a hit that opened her side from ribs to hip. I remember the sound she made. I remember thinking, very clearly, this is it. This is the day I watch someone die because my healing spell is trash. I panicked. I poured everything I had into her, screaming the incantation, both hands shaking against the wound. And this time, instead of the usual slow crawl, something snapped open inside me. My arms went black to the elbow. The wound on her side didn't close gently. It got torn out, yanked from her body like something reeling in a fishing line, and it slammed into the serpent's open jaw from 15 feet away. The serpent's head came apart like wet paper. I stood there holding a half-healed girl, staring at a monster 3 tiers above us lying dead in 2 pieces, and I had absolutely no idea what had just happened. Ivy didn't either. She just kept saying thank you, over and over, half delirious from blood loss, no idea that the thing that saved her life had also just rewritten everything I thought I knew about my own class. I didn't tell the guild. Obviously, I didn't tell the guild. If I walked into Ashvane Company and said, "Hey, so it turns out my healing spell converts the severity of a wound into a kill strike against a nearby enemy," do you know what happens? They investigate. They test me. They put a leash on me and parade me around as a weapon instead of a person, and Reaper's Mercy classes, if that's even what this was, have a nasty habit in old texts of being labeled cursed, dangerous, unstable. I'd seen what happens to people who get labeled unstable. I wasn't about to volunteer for it, so I kept being the trash healer. I kept letting Drayson mock me. I kept letting the guild treat me like dead weight, because dead weight doesn't get watched closely, and I needed to understand what I actually was before anyone else found out. Turns out understanding it meant testing it, quietly, on my own time, in low-level dungeons where nobody paid attention to some E-rank support running solo drills after hours. And what I found out made my stomach drop every single time. The rule was simple, and it was brutal. The worse the wound I healed, the harder the retaliation strike against the nearest hostile target. A scraped knee healed into basically nothing, a flick of static that wouldn't bruise a rat. But a wound that was actually life-threatening, the kind where someone's a heartbeat from dying, that healed into something closer to a war crime. My class didn't fix people. It weighed their suffering, and it made something else pay for it. I started calling it, in my own head, the toll. Every heal had a cost, and the cost got paid by whatever monster was standing closest. The bigger the injury, the bigger the bill. And that meant the trash healer everyone laughed at was sitting on something that could, in the right situation, drop a boss in a single cast. I just needed my allies to almost die first. Which is, if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, an absolutely horrifying thing to base a strategy around. I told myself I'd never use it in a real guild raid. Too dangerous, too easy to get caught, too easy for someone to get hurt worse than almost if my timing was off. I told myself a lot of things back then that didn't survive contact with Ashvane Company's ambition. See, the guild had been chasing an A-rank certification for over a year, which meant they needed to clear an A-rank dungeon core, which meant they needed every able body they had, including their embarrassing E-rank healer, because guild law required a certified support class on every certification run whether the guildmaster liked it or not. And Guildmaster Alistair Voss did not like it. He said as much in the strategy meeting, in front of everyone, looking at me like I was a paperwork error he was stuck with. Vale comes because the charter says he has to, Voss said. He does not engage. He does not draw aggro. He stands in the back, he throws his little heals, and if things go bad, Thorn, you get everyone out. Understood. Drayson smirked at me across the table. Don't worry, healer. I won't let you slow us down too much. I said nothing. What was there to say? I just sat there thinking about the toll, thinking about what happens when the wound is bad enough, and some small, mean part of me was already looking forward to the day this guild found out exactly what they'd been mocking. That day almost came sooner than I expected, and almost cost someone their life to get there. The A-rank dungeon was called the Hollow Choir, a cathedral-shaped nightmare built entirely out of bone and echo, where the walls themselves screamed if you moved too fast. 12 of us went in. Drayson led the vanguard. Ren Calloway, our S-rank archer, and honestly the only person in the guild who'd ever treated me like a human being instead of a punchline, ran Overwatch. I brought up the rear with the healing squad, exactly where Voss wanted me, exactly where nobody would notice what I actually was. For the first 2 floors, everything went according to plan, which in hindsight should have worried me, because dungeons that go according to plan are usually saving something up. Floor 3 is where it saved it for. The boss of the Hollow Choir was a thing called a bone cantor, a towering robed horror made of stitched-together skeletal remains that sang instead of roared, and every note it sang cracked the ground open beneath our feet. Drayson charged in first, arrogant as always, certain his S-rank strength would carve through it in minutes. It didn't. The cantor caught his blade on its forearm, twisted, and threw him 30 feet into a pillar hard enough to crack stone. He went down clutching his side, and even from the back of the formation I could see it. Blood pooling too fast, ribs at an angle, ribs are never supposed to be at. Voss started screaming for a retreat. Ren was already firing arrows into the cantor's exposed jaw, buying seconds. And every healer on the squad rushed toward Drayson at once, because that's what you're trained to do. That's what good soldiers do. They save the strongest fighter first. I got there before any of them because I wasn't thinking like a soldier. I was thinking about the toll. I dropped to my knees next to Drayson Thorne, the man who'd spent 6 months calling me dead weight, and for one very ugly second I thought about not healing him at all. About letting the guild find out the hard way what happens when you throw away the person who could have saved you. I'm not proud of that thought. It lasted maybe half a heartbeat. Then I put my hands on his chest and I healed him anyway. Because whatever else I am, I'm not the kind of person who lets someone die to prove a point. My arms went black past the elbow. The wound in his side didn't close so much as it got torn free, dragged out of him in a visible ribbon of dark light that whipped across the room and slammed directly into the bone canter's open, singing mouth. The explosion cracked 3 pillars and knocked half the squad off their feet. The canter staggered, half its ribcage caved inward, its song dying into a wet, broken groan. It wasn't dead, not yet, but it had gone from unstoppable to reeling in the space of one heartbeat. And every single person in that cathedral had just watched the healing squad's designated dead weight do it. Drayson stared up at me, his side knitting closed under my hands, his eyes wide with something that wasn't gratitude yet, more like disbelief trying to find a place to land. "What?" he said, voice hoarse. "The hell was that?" I didn't have a good answer ready. I hadn't planned on anyone seeing this. My whole strategy for the last 6 months had been staying invisible, staying underestimated, and in one panicked decision I'd just torn that entire plan apart, in front of 11 witnesses and a guildmaster who was going to have a lot of very uncomfortable questions. "Later," I said, which is the worst possible answer to give a man who just watched you turn his near death into a weapon. "Right now, we finish this." Ren was the one who moved first, snapping out of the shock faster than anyone. "You heard him," she shouted, already knocking another arrow. Whatever that was, it worked. Push the advantage, now. The squad regrouped around a plan nobody had agreed to 5 seconds earlier, one built entirely around the trash healer's secret weapon. Drayson, still catching his breath, forced himself upright, and for the first time since I joined Ashvane Company, he looked at me like I was worth something. "If you can do that again," he said, "I will personally never call you dead weight for the rest of my life. You're going to have to get hurt worse for it to work better," I told him, which probably wasn't the reassurance he expected. He barked out a laugh that sounded half like pain. "Great, wonderful. Love that for me." We hit the bone canter with everything we had left. It fought back hard, its jaw hanging loose from the earlier hit, its song turning ragged and furious, cracking the floor into fissures that swallowed 2 of our support staff whole before Ren could drag them clear. It was ugly. It was close. And at the very end, it came down to me again, kneeling over Ren Calloway herself this time, her shoulder torn open from a glancing hit that should have taken her whole arm off, and I made a choice I hadn't fully thought through. I healed her at the worst possible moment, in the open, in full view of the entire remaining squad, and let the toll do what it does. The retaliation strike hit the canter's exposed skull dead center, and this time there was no reeling, no staggering. There was just a body made of bone and stitched horror falling apart in the air, mid-collapse, gone before it finished hitting the ground. We'd cleared an A-rank dungeon boss. Ashvane Company had its certification, and every single person standing in that cathedral was staring at me like they'd never actually seen me before, which, in a way, they hadn't. Guildmaster Voss found his voice first, and it came out sharp, suspicious, the tone of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Vale, what exactly is your class?" I opened my mouth to lie, because lying had kept me safe for 6 months, and every instinct I had told me to keep lying now. Then Drayson, of all people, stepped in front of me, arms crossed, side still healing under his torn armor. "His class," Drayson said, "just saved my life, and won us an A-rank clear in the same 5 minutes. Whatever it's called, I don't care, and neither should you." It wasn't protection exactly. Drayson Thorne didn't strike me as the protective type. It was closer to a man who'd built his entire identity on being the strongest in the room, suddenly realizing there was someone stronger standing 3 feet away, and deciding, in real time, that being on that person's good side was smarter than being on his bad one. Voss wasn't as easily satisfied. His eyes stayed narrow, calculating, the look of a guildmaster who'd just discovered he'd been undervaluing an asset for 6 months and was already wondering how much he could squeeze out of it. "We'll discuss this back at the guild hall," he said, which in guildmaster language meant, "I am absolutely going to try to use you." I should have seen that coming. I did see that coming. I walked out of the hollow choir already knowing that the moment I got back within guild walls, everything about my quiet, invisible existence was going to change, and there wasn't a single thing I could do to stop it. The next morning, the whole guild knew. Not the specifics, Voss was too careful to broadcast the exact mechanic, but everyone knew the trash healer had somehow single-handedly turned the tide on an A-rank boss fight, and rumors in a guild hall move faster than any monster. By midday, people who'd never once bothered to learn my name were suddenly finding reasons to walk past my quarters. By evening, Voss had called an emergency officer meeting, and I wasn't invited, which told me everything I needed to know about how that conversation was going to go. I caught the tail end of it anyway, because Ren tracked me down afterward, still in her field gear, expression unreadable in that careful way she had. "They want to reclassify you," she said. "No preamble," because Ren never bothered with preamble. "Voss is pushing to have you registered as a combat support hybrid instead of standard healer. Means you get pulled off rotation duty. Means you go on every high-value raid from now on, frontline adjacent, positioned specifically so your heals can double as strikes." "That's not how it's supposed to work," I said, which was true, and also completely irrelevant, because guilds don't care how something is supposed to work, they care how it can be used. "I know," Ren said. "I told him that. He didn't care." She hesitated, and for a second the careful mask slipped, something closer to actual worry underneath it. "Rowan, the way that class works, from what I saw in there, it needs someone almost dying to get strong. You understand what that means if Voss builds strategies around it? It means someone on this team is going to end up hurt on purpose, over and over, because it's efficient." I hadn't let myself think that far ahead yet, and hearing her say it out loud made my stomach turn in a way the actual dungeon fight hadn't. 6 months of being mocked, dismissed, treated like dead weight, and the first time anyone in that guild saw real value in me, it came wrapped in a strategy that required my friends to bleed for it. "I won't let that happen," I said, and I meant it, even though I had no idea yet how I was going to stop a guildmaster who'd already decided what I was worth. "Good," Ren said, "because I'm not letting it happen either. Whatever this turns into, you're not doing it alone." That should have been a comforting thought. It wasn't, not entirely, because the next morning Voss summoned me to his office alone, and the first thing he said when the door closed behind me had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with ambition. "Ashvane Company has been sitting at rank 14 for 2 years, he said, not looking up from the paperwork on his desk. "Rank 14 doesn't get sponsorships. Rank 14 doesn't get invited to the Sovereign Tournament. Rank 14 watches other guilds take the contracts we should have. Do you know what breaks a guild out of rank 14, Vale?" "I have a guess," I said. "A weapon nobody else has." He finally looked up, and there was something hungry in his expression that made the black-veined power under my skin feel suddenly very small in comparison. "You clear an S-rank dungeon core for this guild, publicly, in front of the ranking committee, and Ashvane Company jumps from 14 to top 5 overnight. You do that, and I'll make sure nobody ever calls you dead weight again. And if I say no?" Voss smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Then I suppose the ranking committee finds out we've been sitting on an unregistered, unclassified support anomaly for 6 months without reporting it. That's a violation, Vale, a serious one. For the guild, and for you personally?" He let that sit in the air between us, cold and deliberate. "I'd rather we not have that conversation, wouldn't you?" There it was, 6 months of being underestimated, and the moment they finally understood what I was worth, the very first thing this guild did with that knowledge was point it back at my throat. I stood there in his office, black veins long since faded back to ordinary skin, looking every bit like the harmless E-rank healer everyone had spent 6 months laughing at, and I thought about Ivy in the swamp dungeon, about Drayson's ribs cracking against that pillar, about Ren's shoulder torn open under my hands, about every single almost that had gotten me here. And I thought about the S-rank dungeon core Voss wanted me to clear, a place guild scouts whispered about, like a graveyard, a dungeon that had swallowed 3 separate top 10 guilds whole in the last 2 years, and never let a single one of them walk back out clean. "Fine," I heard myself say. I'll do it. Voss's smile widened, satisfied, already counting the sponsorship money in his head. He had no idea what he was actually asking for. He thought he'd just leashed a weapon. What he'd actually done was hand the trash healer of Ashvane Company a reason to stop holding anything back. Because if this guild wanted to see what Reaper's Mercy really looked like at full power, if they wanted to drag me into an S-rank corps where the toll would finally get paid in full, then they were about to learn something that 6 months of mockery had conveniently let them forget. Every single person who'd ever laughed at me, called me dead weight, made me the punchline at the bar, was about to walk into that dungeon standing directly behind the one person in this guild who could turn their worst moment into someone else's last one. And I was done being quiet about what that meant. The S-rank corps had a name, whispered more than spoken. The kind guilds only say once and then never again. They called it the Cradle. And 3 days from now, Ashvane Company was walking into it, with me at the center of a plan built entirely around how badly someone could get hurt. I didn't know yet that the Cradle wasn't just a dungeon. I didn't know that its true boss had been sealed there for a reason nobody in Voss's paperwork had bothered to mention. And I definitely didn't know that the moment I stepped through its gate, the guild that had spent 6 months underestimating me was about to find out exactly how much worse than deadweight I could be. That part of the story starts with a scream, and it isn't mine. The Cradle's gate looked wrong the moment we stepped through it, less like a dungeon entrance and more like a wound in the world that hadn't finished healing. The sky inside was the color of a fresh bruise, and the ground pulsed faintly under our boots, like we were standing on something with a heartbeat. 20 of Ashvane Company's best walked in behind Voss that morning. He'd brought everyone. Drayson at the front, Ren on Overwatch, Ivy, the scout I'd saved my first week discovering what I really was, tagging along on her first S-rank assignment, practically vibrating with excitement she had no idea was misplaced. I hated that she was there. I said so, quietly, to Voss before we crossed the gate. She earned her spot, he said, already moving past me. Everyone earns their spot, Vale, including you. Including me. Like I hadn't been dragged here with a threat hanging over my head. I swallowed the argument, because arguing with Voss had never once worked, and followed my guild into a dungeon that swallowed top 10 teams whole. The first 2 floors were quiet in the worst way, the kind of quiet that makes veteran adventurers check their weapons twice. Ren caught up to me somewhere around the second floor's collapsed cathedral hall, voice low enough that only I could hear it. "Whatever's waiting at the bottom of this place," she said. "Voss is planning to use you the second things go wrong." I heard him briefing the vanguard. "He wants Drayson to bait the boss into a heavy hit deliberately, so you can trigger the toll on command." My stomach dropped somewhere around my boots. "He wants Drayson to get hurt on purpose." "He wants someone to get hurt on purpose," Ren corrected, grim. "Drayson's just the one who volunteered, because apparently getting his ribs cracked once made him decide he trusts you with his life now. Which, honestly, might be the single dumbest thing that man has ever done, and he's done a lot of dumb things. I should have felt something like gratitude, hearing that Drayson trusted me. Mostly what I felt was sick. This was exactly what I'd promised Ren I wouldn't let happen, and here it was happening anyway. 3 floors underground in a dungeon that ate top 10 guilds for breakfast, because a guildmaster wanted a ranking upgrade badly enough to gamble with his own people's blood to get it. We didn't get the chance to argue strategy any further, because the floor gave out from under Ivy without warning, a section of pulsing ground simply opening like a mouth, and something came up through it that hadn't been in any of the scouting reports. It was tall, taller than the bone canter, taller than anything I'd healed my way through in 6 months of secret training, built out of what looked like fused, half-formed adventurer armor, dozens of sets melted together into one shrieking, many-limbed horror. Later we'd learn it was called a Husk Warden, a boss-tier construct made from the failed equipment of every team the Cradle had ever swallowed, and standing in front of it felt like standing in front of a graveyard that had decided to get up and walk. It grabbed Ivy before anyone could react. I don't remember deciding to run toward her. I just remember being there, suddenly, skidding across pulsing ground while Drayson screamed something behind me and Ren's arrows lit up the dark overhead, and Ivy's small, terrified face looking at me through a gap in the warden's fused metal fingers like I was the only thing left in the world that could fix this. The warden's grip cracked 2 of her ribs before Drayson's blade forced it to let go. She hit the ground limp, blood already pooling beneath her, and every training instinct in my body screamed at me to hold back, to be careful, because this was the moment Voss had been quietly engineering the whole raid to reach. I healed her anyway. Of course I healed her anyway. Some things aren't strategy, they're just what you do. My arms went black to the shoulder this time, further than they'd ever gone before, and the wound tearing itself free of Ivy's small frame came out as something closer to a wave than a ribbon, black light crackling across the whole battlefield before it slammed into the Husk Warden's fused chestplate, hard enough to buckle steel that had survived a dozen dead adventuring parties. The Warden staggered. It didn't fall, and that's when I understood, with a cold, sinking certainty, that this thing was built to survive exactly the kind of hit I'd just thrown at it, because it was made from the corpses of people who'd already tried. Again! Voss was shouting somewhere behind me, and there was no mistaking the tone now, no pretending it was concern for his people. Get him another target, now, whatever it takes. That's when Drayson did something I will never fully forgive him for, and never fully thank him for either, both at once, tangled together the way the worst decisions always are. He threw himself directly into the Husk Warden's next swing. He didn't have to. He was fast enough to dodge, strong enough to block. He chose not to. Deliberately, taking a hit meant to cave in armor and turning it into the single worst injury I'd ever had to look at, because he'd decided, in the space of half a second, that the guild needed the toll paid in full more than he needed to walk away clean. He hit the ground in pieces of what used to be a battle-hardened S-rank vanguard, and for one horrifying moment I genuinely thought I was too late, that Voss's gamble had finally cost exactly what Ren warned it would. "Rowan!" Ren's voice, sharp, right beside me, an arrow already knocked and aimed at the Warden's exposed core. "Do it now! Whatever it costs, do it now." I dropped to my knees next to Drayson Thorne, hands shaking, and I put everything I had left into healing a wound that should not have been survivable, and this time the black didn't stop at my shoulder. It climbed my neck, crawled across my jaw, and for one terrifying second I felt like the toll wasn't just taking the wound from him, it was reaching into something inside me too, some deeper well I hadn't known existed until that exact moment. The strike that came out of it wasn't a wave, it was a detonation. It hit the Husk Warden's fused core dead center, and the entire construct came apart at once. Decades of stolen armor and stolen lives unraveling in a single blinding pulse of black light, pieces of it raining down across the pulsing floor like the dungeon itself was weeping scrap metal. The silence afterward was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Drayson was breathing. Barely, but breathing, the wound sealed shut under my hands, his eyes fluttering open just long enough to focus on my face. "Told you," he rasped, voice wrecked but somehow still smug, "I'd never call you dead weight again." I laughed, and it came out half a sob, because I genuinely thought for a moment I was about to watch someone die for a guildmaster's ranking ambitions, and instead I was staring down at a leveled S-rank boss and a man who'd bet his life on trusting me and won. Voss walked up through the wreckage a moment later, and the look on his face wasn't relief. It was calculation, cold and immediate, already running numbers on what this meant for the guild's ranking, already planning the announcement, already thinking about sponsorships and the sovereign tournament, and every door this one fight had just kicked open. He didn't ask if Drayson was all right. He didn't ask if Ivy was stable. The first thing out of his mouth was a question aimed entirely at me. "Can you do that again?" he said. "On command, with a proper target selected in advance?" I looked at him standing in a field of scrap metal that used to be dozens of dead adventurers' armor, next to a man who'd nearly died proving a guildmaster's theory correct, and something in me that had spent 6 months quietly absorbing every insult, every dismissal, every dead-weight comment finally, completely ran out of patience. "No," I said. "I can't. Not like that. Not ever like that again." Voss's expression flickered, annoyance breaking through the calculation. "Vale, do you understand what we just achieved? Do you understand what this means for the guild's standing?" "I understand exactly what it means," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "It means you were willing to let Drayson die to move up a ranking list. It means the second I said no to your little arrangement in your office, you were going to report me as an unregistered anomaly and let the committee handle the rest. So no, I'm not going to be your on-command weapon." The whole squad had gone quiet, watching this unfold, And for the first time since I joined Ashvane Company, I wasn't the one people were staring at with pity or mockery. I was the one people were staring at wondering what I'd do next, and honestly, so was I. Ren stepped up beside me before Voss could answer, bow still loose in her hand, expression carved from stone. "For what it's worth," she said, loud enough for the whole squad to hear, "I'm with him, whatever happens next." Drayson, still catching his breath on the ground, managed a weak, ragged laugh. "Add me to that list. Somebody's going to have to carry me out of here anyway. Might as well be the guy who just saved my life twice." Voss looked around at his own squad, at the officers and vanguard he'd spent years building loyalty with, and found most of them looking anywhere but at him. That's the thing about ambition built on other people's blood. It works right up until the people bleeding start doing the math themselves. "This isn't over," Voss said, and there was a warning in it, thin and brittle, the sound of a man who just watched controls slip through his fingers and hadn't yet figured out how to get it back. "The committee will still want answers about what you are, Vale. I can protect you from that, or I can let it happen. Think carefully about which one you want." I helped Drayson to his feet, felt Ivy's small hand grip mine as Ren lifted her carefully off the ground, and looked back at the guildmaster who'd spent 6 months calling me dead weight in every way that mattered except the words themselves, and I felt something settle in my chest, cold and certain. "I've spent 6 months being underestimated by everyone in this guild," I said. "I already know exactly what happens when people find out what I really am. I'm done being afraid of it." We walked out of the cradle that day with an S-rank boss cleared, a story that would rewrite Ashvane Company's ranking within the week, and a guildmaster who now knew, with absolute certainty, that the weapon he'd been planning to leash had just decided it wasn't anyone's weapon at all. What none of us knew yet, walking out through that bruised, pulsing gate into ordinary daylight, was that the ranking committee had already heard rumors about an unclassified support anomaly clearing S-rank cores solo in secret months before this raid ever happened. And rumors like that don't stay contained to one guild for long. Somewhere in the capital, a very different kind of hunter was already reading my file, and Ashvane Company's ranking was about to become the least of anyone's problems. Auron Castellan didn't knock. That's the detail that stays with me the longest, looking back. She walked straight through the front doors of Ashvane Company's guild hall like she already owned the building, 2 silent escorts flanking her, and a sealed writ in her hand with the ranking committee's crest burned into black wax. Voss was mid-sentence in the officers' hall, still riding high off the cradle clear, still practicing the version of the story where he came out looking brave, when the doors slammed open and every conversation in the room died at once. I felt it before I saw her. That's the part that scared me. Some instinct buried under 6 months of being ignored sat up straight and screamed, "This is the danger Ren warned you about," and it was right. "Rowan Vale," Castellan said, not a question, scanning the room until her eyes landed directly on me like she'd memorized my face from a file before she ever set foot in this building. "Unclassified support, formerly registered E-rank, guild affiliation Ashvane Company. You're going to want to sit down for this conversation. Everyone else in this room is going to want to leave." Nobody left. Drayson planted himself at my shoulder without a word, arms crossed, side still healing under a fresh wrap of bandages from 3 days ago. Ren didn't move either, bow already loose in her hand the way it always was when she didn't trust a room. Voss, to his credit or his cowardice, stepped forward fast enough to nearly trip over his own boots, already smiling the smile he used on sponsors. "Investigator," he said, "welcome to Ashvane Company. If this is about the cradle clear, I assure you, we followed every protocol." "This isn't about the cradle," Castellan said, and unrolled the writ without looking at him. "This is about the fact that your guild has been harboring an unregistered anomaly class support for 6 months without filing so much as a single report to the committee, which is a violation carrying a mandatory investigation, a possible seizure of guild charter, and, depending on how cooperative everyone in this room chooses to be in the next 10 minutes, a great deal of very public embarrassment for Ashvane Company specifically." I watched Voss's face do something ugly and fast, the exact math Ren had warned me he'd do, calculating how much of me he could give up to save the guild's reputation. It didn't take him long. "Of course," he said, "we're happy to cooperate fully, whatever the committee requires." "Good," Castellan said, and finally looked at me directly, And I understood in that one look that she'd already decided I was the only interesting person in the room. Then you won't mind if I take Vale somewhere private and see exactly what he is. That's the line that stops mattering the second you hear it, and starts mattering a lot more the second you're standing alone in a warded testing chamber 3 floors below the guild hall, stripped of every excuse you've spent 6 months building, about to show a stranger with a sealed writ and a committee badge the thing you've been hiding since a swamp dungeon nearly killed a 17-year-old scout. Let me back up though, because there's context here that matters, and none of it makes sense without understanding who Auron Castellan actually was before she became the person about to decide the rest of my life. She wasn't guild. That was obvious the moment she walked in. From the plain gray coat with no faction crest, to the way she moved like someone who'd never once needed backup, because backup implied she might fail. Capital investigators worked directly for the ranking committee, the body that decided which classes got published in the public system registry and which classes got quietly filed under headings nobody outside the capital ever saw. Rumor in the guild circuit said investigators like her existed specifically to handle anomalies, the classes that didn't fit the neat tiered structure everyone else operated inside. E rank to S rank, healer to vanguard, mage to tank. All of it built on decades of careful categorization. And then there was whatever I was, unclassified. A gap in the system nobody had bothered explaining, because for 6 months nobody in power had known the gap existed. Voss walked us down to the testing chamber himself, practically vibrating with nervous energy, already trying to renegotiate terms before we'd even reached the door. Investigator, surely there's room for discussion here. Ashvane Company discovered this anomaly. We've managed it responsibly. If the committee is looking for a partnership arrangement rather than a seizure, I think you'll find we're extremely open to— You're not part of this conversation, Castellan said, without breaking stride. You're the guildmaster who sat on a mandatory report for 6 months because it was convenient for you. Right now you're lucky I'm not opening a separate file with your name on it. Voss's mouth snapped shut. I almost laughed. Would have laughed if I hadn't been 3 steps from a chamber where a capital investigator was about to make me prove exactly how dangerous I was. The testing chamber was nothing like I expected. No cages, no restraints, no theatrical machinery. Just a wide circular room lined with faintly glowing wards, the kind designed to contain a fight without letting it spread past the walls, and a single wounded practice construct standing motionless in the center, built specifically to be healed and hurt without consequence. Castellan stood at the edge of the ward line, arms folded, and gestured at the construct like she was asking me to pass a salt shaker. Standard procedure, she said. You heal the construct. I observe the mechanism. We determine classification. This can be simple, or it can be complicated, and complicated involves a lot more paperwork for both of us. Your choice which version we do. Behind her, in the observation gallery, I could see Voss pressed against the glass, and beside him, refusing to be left out, Drayson and Wren, standing close enough together that it was obvious neither of them had asked permission to be there. Someone, probably Wren, had physically blocked the door when a guild officer tried to keep them out. I found out later Drayson told the officer, quote, that he'd personally escort him through a wall if he didn't step aside. Nobody stepped in his way twice. Fine, I said, because there wasn't a version of this where saying no worked out better. Simple version. I walked to the construct, put my hand on its chest, and cast the spell the way I would on any wound that wasn't life-threatening, small, controlled, the kind of healing that used to embarrass me in front of the whole guild. The wound on the construct's chest closed slowly, painfully slowly, by any normal healer's standard, and nothing happened. No black veins, no retaliation strike, just the same pathetic crawl everyone had mocked me for since day one. Castellan's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Interesting. Severity scaled activation. The mechanism doesn't trigger below a certain threshold of injury. She tapped a small crystal device against her palm, recording something I couldn't see. We're going to need to see the actual mechanism, Vale, not the version you use to look harmless. That means someone gets hurt, I said flat. That's usually how you test a healing class, Castellan said, unbothered. Fortunately, I came prepared. She gestured, and one of her silent escorts stepped forward and, without a word of warning, drove a blade cleanly through his own forearm. I froze. He didn't even flinch. Blood welled up dark and immediate, and he simply held the wounded arm out toward me like he was handing me a tool, expression completely blank, the kind of blank that told me this wasn't the first time he'd volunteered for something like this. "He's registered for exactly this purpose," Castellan said, at my hesitation. "Consensual, contracted, healed fully afterward regardless of outcome. Heal it, Vale, properly this time." I looked at Drayson through the observation glass. He gave me a short, grim nod, the kind that said, "I did worse than this for you 3 days ago, don't hesitate now." Ren's face was harder to read, careful and still, but she didn't look away either. I put my hands on the wound, and I stopped holding back. The black climbed my arm immediately, faster than it had that first time in the swamp. Easier now, like my body had learned the shape of the thing living inside my class and stopped fighting it. The wound tore itself free of the man's forearm in a thin, dark ribbon, and instead of a monster 15 feet away, it slammed harmlessly into a warded practice dummy set up specifically to absorb it. The dummy detonated into scorched fragments across the far wall. The man's arm was whole, not even a scar. He flexed his fingers once, expression still blank, and stepped back into position like nothing had happened. Castellan didn't look surprised. That unsettled me more than if she had. "Severity conversion confirmed," she said, mostly to herself, tapping notes into her crystal device. "Wound magnitude directly proportional to output force. That matches the historical pattern almost exactly." She glanced up at me, and for the first time, there was something underneath the professional coldness, something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. "Do you know what happens to your body every time you push past a certain threshold, Vale?" "It hurts," I said. "A lot. That's about the extent of my research." "It scars," she said, "permanently. And I don't mean cosmetically." She walked closer, close enough that the ward line between us hummed faintly against the air. "The black marking you get during activation, it's supposed to recede completely afterward. Every time. That's the baseline function. But every anomaly class case on record with your specific signature shows a pattern of scarring that doesn't fully retreat once the wound you're converting crosses a certain severity. A little residue stays, permanently, and it accumulates." My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the dungeon and everything to do with the very specific, very clinical way she said permanently. "How much is a little?" I said. "Ask him to check your left forearm," Castellan said, nodding at the silent escort. "Under the sleeve. 3rd Division Standard Field Kit includes a scanning charm for exactly this." The escort walked over without being asked twice, pressed 2 fingers to a small brass charm, and traced it slowly up the inside of my forearm, the one that had gone black past the elbow 3 days ago, healing Drayson in the cradle. I felt a faint, cold tingle where the charm passed, and the escort's expression, blank the entire session, finally flickered into something like surprise. "There's residual marking," he said, glancing at Castellan. "Faint, consistent with post-catastrophic activation." I pulled my sleeve back myself, hands not quite steady, and there it was. A thin, dark line, almost invisible against my skin unless the light hit it exactly right, running from my wrist up past my elbow, in the exact shape my veins had taken when I healed Drayson at the Husk Warden. It hadn't faded completely after all. It had just gotten quiet enough for me not to notice. "That's from one use," Castellan said. "One catastrophic severity activation. You've had at least 2, from what your guildmaster's incident report described, before he conveniently forgot to file it with anyone official." She let that land, sharp and deliberate, a shot aimed at Voss through the glass that he absolutely felt. "The historical record on anomaly class casualties from your specific bloodline signature isn't encouraging, Vale. The scarring doesn't stay thin. It doesn't stay faint. Every activation adds to it, and there's a point, differs person to person, where the accumulated scarring stops being cosmetic and starts being systemic." "Systemic meaning what?" I said, though some small, cold part of me already knew the shape of the answer before she said it out loud. "Meaning eventually it isn't your arm anymore," Castellan said. "It's everything. And the historical cases where that happened didn't end well for the people wearing the marks." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse, like she was reading me a weather report instead of a countdown. "I'm telling you this not to frighten you. I'm telling you because you're going to keep using this power, one way or another, whether the committee sanctions it or not. Ashvane Company is not equipped to manage that. Nobody without direct committee resources is." I stood there in a warded chamber with a healed stranger's blood still faintly staining my hands, staring at a permanent black line on my own arm that I hadn't even known was there until an investigator with a scanning charm pointed it out, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel through all 6 months of mockery and one very bad night in a swamp dungeon and a boss fight that turned a bully into someone who trusted me with his life. I felt scared. Actually scared. Not of Castellan, of the thing living under my own skin. Behind the glass, I saw Drayson say something sharp to the guild officer who'd tried to keep him and Ren out earlier. Saw him physically step past the man toward the chamber door, and I heard, faintly, Ren's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough testing for one day," she said, loud enough to carry, already moving toward the entrance. "He's not a specimen." Castellan held up a hand without even turning around, and somehow that single gesture was enough to stop both Ren and Drayson at the threshold. Some quiet authority in it that made even 2 S-rank fighters hesitate. "One more demonstration," she said to me, ignoring them entirely. "Controlled release. I need to confirm you have baseline control over activation threshold, not just reactive triggering. Can you initiate the mechanism deliberately, without an actual wound present, at low output?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never tried." "Then try now," she said, carefully. "I'd rather not lose the practice dummy budget for the month." I looked down at my own hands, at the faint permanent line tracing up my left forearm that I still hadn't fully processed, and I reached for the same feeling I got when I healed someone, the exact sensation of a wound tearing itself loose and demanding somewhere to go, except this time there was no wound. No injury, just me, standing in a warded room, trying to summon the black on command like it was a party trick instead of whatever it actually was. Nothing happened at first, just an uncomfortable pulling sensation behind my sternum, like trying to flex a muscle I didn't fully know how to locate. Then, slowly, faintly, a thin trace of black crawled up 2 fingers on my right hand, weak, barely visible, and a tiny controlled pulse of dark light no bigger than a coin flickered against my palm before fading out completely. Castellan watched it happen with an intensity that made me feel like a puzzle piece finally clicking into a shape she'd been assembling for a long time. "Controlled, low-output activation. Confirmed," she said, tapping notes rapidly now. "That's significant. Most anomaly class casualties on record couldn't do that. Purely reactive triggering, no deliberate control." She lowered the crystal device, finally, and looked at me directly, and for the first time since she'd walked through the guild hall doors, her expression softened into something almost close to respect. "You're not what I expected walking in here, Vale. Trash healer who accidentally became a war crime," I said. "Yeah, I get that a lot lately." Something that might have been the start of a real smile crossed her face, before she smoothed it back into professional neutrality. "The committee's official position on unregistered anomaly classes is straightforward. You get logged, monitored, and restricted from independent field activity until a formal classification review, which for anomaly class cases historically takes anywhere from 6 months to several years. During that time, you don't heal anyone above E-rank injury severity without a licensed observer present. You don't participate in any dungeon clear above C-rank. Your guild loses access to you for anything ambitious, which, given what I just heard about Voss's ranking ambitions, I suspect will not go over well with your guildmaster. Through the glass, I watched Voss's face do something complicated and unhappy, torn between wanting to protest and knowing exactly how bad it would look to argue with a committee investigator on record. "That's the official position," I said carefully. "Which means there's an unofficial one." Castellan's mouth twitched, almost amused. "You catch on fast." She stepped closer to the ward line, lowering her voice slightly. "Not quite private, but clearly not meant for the observation gallery either. There's a unit. Capital sanctioned, small, off the standard ranking ladder entirely. We don't operate under guild charter rules. We handle cases the regular system isn't built for. Anomaly classes, suppressed bloodlines, the kind of threats that don't fit neatly into E through S rank. If you join, you get full access to committee resources, medical research specifically targeting scarring stabilization, protection from exactly the kind of exploitation your guildmaster was already planning before I walked in that door. You'd be monitored, yes, but monitored by people who actually understand what you are, instead of people trying to figure out how to profit off it. And if I say no," I said, because I already knew, deep down, that there was always a version of this question with teeth in it. Then you get registered as an unmonitored threat, Castellan said, plainly, no theatrical weight to it, which somehow made it land harder. Not a punishment, a classification. It means every guild in the capital gets a flag on your file warning them you're an unregistered risk requiring supervision they're not equipped to provide, which functionally means no guild will touch you without committee oversight anyway, except now you're doing it with none of the protections and all of the exposure. Rival guilds like Draven Concord specifically hunt talent flagged that way. Vale, ambitious, powerful, and legally unprotected, is exactly the kind of profile certain guilds go out of their way to poach. The name meant nothing to me in that moment, just another guild I'd never had reason to think about, but I noticed the way Castellan's jaw tightened slightly when she said it, like it cost her something to bring it up at all, like there was history there she wasn't fully sharing. That's not a real choice, I said. One option is a leash, the other option is a target painted on my back. Welcome to being an anomaly, Castellan said, without a trace of sympathy, though something underneath the words suggested she understood exactly how unfair that sounded. I'm not going to pretend either option is good. I'm going to tell you the truth, which is more than most people in your situation get. The unit is a leash, yes. It's also the only leash in this city that comes with actual protection attached to it. You have 3 days to decide. After that, the committee makes the decision for you, and you will not like the version where I'm not the one making it. She turned to go, escort falling into step behind her, and paused at the ward line's edge, glancing back at me one more time with an expression I couldn't fully place, something caught between professional distance and a warning she wasn't technically supposed to give. For what it's worth, she said, quieter now. The historical anomaly class cases I mentioned earlier, the ones with your bloodline signature. I didn't tell you the full pattern. There's more to it than scarring, Vale, a lot more. Things the committee has kept buried for longer than either of us has been alive. She held my gaze for one more second, like she was deciding how much to say and choosing, deliberately, to stop short. You should think very carefully about which choice actually keeps you safest. Not from the committee, from what you're going to find out about yourself if you keep pushing this power without help. She left without another word, escort trailing behind her, and the chamber door sealed shut with a quiet, final click that felt a great deal heavier than it should have. I stood alone in the warded room for a long moment after she'd gone, staring at the faint black line tracing up my forearm. The first physical proof that this class was quietly, permanently rewriting something inside me every single time I used it to save someone I cared about. 3 days to choose between a leash with protection and a target with none, and somewhere underneath both options, an investigator's half-finished warning about a bloodline pattern she hadn't fully explained, buried for longer than either of us had been alive. The observation gallery door opened before I could fully process any of it, and Drayson and Wren came through together, both moving fast, both clearly furious on my behalf, in ways that would have surprised me 6 months ago, and now just felt like the shape my life had rearranged itself into. She had no right to test you like that without warning, Wren said immediately, eyes already scanning my arm, my face, checking for damage the way she always did after anything dangerous. A registered volunteer, sure, fine, but pushing you into deliberate activation without prep. I'm fine, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough for the moment. Drayson crossed the room and grabbed my forearm before I could stop him, turning it toward the light, staring at the thin, permanent line with an expression I'd never seen on him before, somewhere between guilt and fury that had nowhere useful to land. This is from healing me, he said. Not a question. Some of it. Probably. I pulled my arm back gently, not wanting to see that expression on his face a second longer than necessary. It's not your fault, Drayson. You didn't ask me to catch a Husk Warden hit for you. I threw myself into that hit on purpose, he said, low and rough. Because I decided the guild needed the toll paid. Same math Voss was doing. I just didn't think about what it actually cost you to pay it. There wasn't a good answer to that, so I didn't try to give him one. Wren stepped between us instead, practical as always even with worry written plainly across her face. 3 days, she said. That's what she gave you? 3 days to pick between a leash and a target, I said. Committee unit with resources and oversight, or unmonitored threat status and every guild with a grudge and a checkbook lining up to poach me before I get hurt worse than I already am. That's not a real choice, Drayson said, echoing exactly what I'd told Castellan minutes earlier. That's what I said too. Ren's expression had gone thoughtful, the careful, calculating look she got before she started planning something. Whatever you decide, she said, you're not deciding it alone. And whatever Voss tries to do with this, to save his own reputation, we're not letting him make that decision for you either. She glanced toward the observation gallery, where I could still see Voss's shape lingering near the glass, clearly debating whether it was safe to come in yet. Speaking of which, he's going to try to spin this to the committee as a guild asset negotiation the second that door opens. I'd bet my bow on it. She was right. Voss came through the chamber door a full minute later, expression already rearranged into the careful, diplomatic mask he wore for sponsors and officials, and the first words out of his mouth confirmed exactly what Ren predicted. Rowan, he said, warm, entirely too warm. I think there's real opportunity here if we play this correctly with the committee. If Ashvane Company were to formally sponsor your registration, position ourselves as your guild of origin in any official capacity going forward, that's leverage. Sponsorship rights. Exclusive first refusal on your field availability. We could negotiate. No, I said, and something in my voice must have carried the exact weight of everything I'd just learned about permanent scarring and buried historical patterns, because Voss actually stopped talking. You don't get to negotiate anything about my future to the committee, not after what you tried to pull before the cradle, not after what Ren told me you were planning to do with Drayson as bait. Voss's jaw tightened, calculation flickering behind his eyes, weighing how hard to push. Whatever he saw in my face, in Drayson's, in Ren's, made him decide against pushing further, at least for now. This is bigger than guild politics, Vale, he said instead, quieter. The committee doesn't make offers like this to people they don't consider significant. Whatever you decide, understand that this is the beginning of something, not the end of it. He left without waiting for a response, and I noticed, watching him go, that for the first time since I'd known him, he looked less like a man calculating his next advantage, and more like a man who genuinely didn't know how this story ended anymore. Small comfort, but I noticed it anyway. Drayson waited until the door closed behind him before speaking again, voice dropping into something more careful than his usual bravado. For what it's worth, he said, whatever you pick, capital unit or not, you're not doing it without us watching your back. That's not up for negotiation either. I don't even know what I'm walking into yet, I said. Castellan said there's more to the bloodline pattern than scarring. She stopped herself before she said what. Ren's eyes narrowed at that, filing it away the same careful way she filed away every piece of dangerous information. Then we find out what she didn't say, she said, before you decide anything. I looked down at the thin black line on my arm one more time, permanent proof that every act of saving someone I cared about was quietly, steadily costing me something I hadn't fully understood until an hour ago, and thought about Castellan's warning, the one she'd delivered like an afterthought right before the door sealed shut behind her. You should think very carefully about which choice actually keeps you safest. Not from the committee, from what you're going to find out about yourself. 3 days to decide between a leash with protection and a target with none, and somewhere underneath both options, an entire history the ranking committee had spent longer than my lifetime keeping buried. I had a feeling, standing there in that warded chamber with a stranger's blood still faintly staining my hands and a permanent mark climbing my arm, that whatever Castellan had almost told me wasn't the kind of thing that stayed buried for long. I was right. It wouldn't even take 3 days.